The cold didn't arrive all at once that night. It crept in slowly, settling into the cracks of the pavement, the metal of the bench, the empty spaces inside his chest. Daniel sat alone, outside the closed train station, Christmas Eve slipping past him in fragments of light and sound he didn't feel part of anymore. Laughter drifted from somewhere down the street. A carol hummed through fog, and a single strand of lights blinked like it was struggling to stay awake. His hands were clasped together, not to pray, but to keep them from shaking. He told himself he was just resting, just waiting for the night to pass. But the truth pressed heavier with every breath. He had nowhere left to go. He didn't notice the footsteps first. What he felt was the change in the air, the quiet awareness that comes when something alive draws near. Then there was the soft click of paws on concrete, measured and calm. When he finally looked up, a police German shepherd stood in front of him, leash slack, eyes locked onto his like they'd been searching for him all along. Behind the dog, an officer slowed to a stop, uncertain. The dog stepped forward anyway, ignoring the command it never received. And in that moment, Daniel felt something stir. Not hope, not yet, but the fragile shock of being seen. The bench was colder than Daniel expected, even through the thin layers of his coat. The metal pressed up into his spine like it was trying to remind him that comfort was a privilege he hadn't earned tonight. Snow hadn't started falling yet, but the air had that sharp metallic smell that came right before it did, the kind that scraped the inside of your nose and made every breath feel deliberate. Christmas Eve moved around him without stopping. Cars passed in slow streaks of light. Somewhere nearby, a group of people laughed too loudly, the sound bursting out and then disappearing just as quickly, like it didn't want to linger near him. Daniel kept his eyes on the ground. The concrete was cracked, darkened by years of salt and rain, small pebbles embedded like forgotten memories. He counted them without really counting, letting his mind drift just enough to avoid the thoughts waiting behind his eyes. He hadn't meant to end up here. That was the lie he kept telling himself. The truth was harder, heavier. He had walked until there was nowhere left to walk to. Every street he knew led back to something he'd lost, and tonight, of all nights, he couldn't bear to stand in front of another door that wouldn't open for him. Christmas Eve used to mean noise, too much food, wrapping paper piling up in corners, someone calling his name from another room. Now it was quiet in a way that felt personal, as if the silence itself knew him and had chosen to sit beside him. His phone was dead in his pocket, not that there was anyone left who would call. He'd checked earlier, even knowing better, scrolling through old messages, old photos, faces that smiled back from another lifetime. He'd shut it off after that, like closing a book he wasn't strong enough to reread. The station behind him was dark, locked tight for the night. A faded poster in the window advertised holiday travel discounts, the smiling faces on it bright and unbothered, heading somewhere warm and welcoming. Daniel laughed under his breath when he saw it, a short humorless sound that vanished into the cold. He wondered how many people passed by him without really seeing him. Just another shape on a bench, another problem they were glad wasn't theirs. He wondered if he looked as empty as he felt. His hands were red, knuckles dry and cracked. He rubbed them together slowly, more out of habit than hope. The cold had worked its way deeper than skin. It lived in his chest now, a weight that made every inhale feel like work. He told himself he was fine. He always did. Fine was easier than admitting how tired he was, how the thought of another morning felt heavier than the night itself. A gust of wind cut through the street, rattling loose decorations and sending a paper cup skidding across the sidewalk. Daniel flinched, shoulders tightening, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to let the ache rise and fall. Memories came anyway, a kitchen warm with yellow light, someone humming softly while tying ribbons, a hand on his shoulder familiar and grounding. He pushed it all away, jaw clenched, breath shallow. Tonight was not the night for remembering. That was when the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden sound, no sharp interruption. Just a subtle shift, like the street itself had taken a breath. Daniel opened his eyes, frowning slightly, his senses picking up on something his thoughts hadn't yet named. The cold felt different, disturbed. Somewhere behind him, leather creaked softly. He heard the measured rhythm of movement, not rushed, not hesitant, purposeful. Then came the sound of pause. They clicked gently against the concrete, steady and controlled, each step placed with intent. Daniel's first instinct was annoyance, a reflex born of too many nights where strangers got too close, where he had to guard what little space he had left. He straightened slightly, shoulders stiff, preparing to look up and ask whoever it was to keep moving. But when he lifted his head, the words never came. A German shepherd stood in front of him, close enough that Daniel could see the faint frost clinging to the edges of its fur. The dog was large, solid, its body a balance of strength and discipline. A police harness rested against its chest, the reflective strips catching the streetlight in soft flashes. Its ears were alert, forward, but its posture wasn't aggressive. It was calm, focused, and its eyes, they were dark and steady, not scanning the street, not distracted by noise or movement. They were locked on Daniel, unblinking, like the dog had found exactly what it was looking for. Daniel felt the impact of that gaze in his chest, a sudden tightness that stole his breath. He hadn't been looked at like that in a long time, not with attention that didn't demand something in return. Behind the dog, a uniformed officer slowed his pace, surprise flickering across his face as the leash went slack. Sorry about that," the officer started, his voice polite, practiced. The dog took a step forward. It wasn't a command. There was no signal Daniel could see. The German shepherd simply moved, closing the small gap between them, lowering its head slightly as if to bring itself closer to Daniel's level. Daniel froze. Every instinct told him not to move, not to scare it, not to break whatever fragile moment this was. Could hear the dog's breathing now, slow and warm, a stark contrast to the cold gnawing at his skin. The dog's nose hovered near Daniel's knee, then brushed against it gently. The contact sent a shock through him, sharp and unexpected. His hands twitched, fingers curling into his sleeves. He swallowed hard, throat tight, eyes burning without warning. The dog didn't pull away. It stayed solid and real, a quiet presence that asked nothing. The officer cleared his throat again, softer this time. "He does this sometimes," he said, almost apologetic. "It stops when he senses, when he thinks someone needs him." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He nodded once, unable to speak, afraid that if he opened his mouth, everything he'd been holding back would spill out onto the cold pavement. The German shepherd sat down in front of him, slow and deliberate, tail resting against the ground. Its eyes never left Daniel's face. For the first time that night, the cold loosened its grip just a little. Daniel didn't know why this was happening. He didn't know what he had done to deserve a moment of warmth on a night that felt determined to strip him of everything else. All he knew was that something had cracked open inside him, something he'd sealed shut for survival. The city kept moving, lights blinked. Somewhere, a bell rang out into the night, and on a bench outside a closed station, a man who had been invisible all evening finally felt seen. The officer shifted his weight, boots crunching softly against the thin layer of ice forming along the sidewalk. He glanced down at the German shepherd, then back at Daniel, as if trying to read the space between them, unsure whether to interrupt or protect it. The city had a way of teaching people when to keep moving, when not to look too closely, but this moment resisted that instinct. It lingered. "My name's Mark," the officer said finally, his voice low, careful not to startle either of them. "We're doing a late patrol. Just checking the station before we head back." Daniel nodded again. The words felt distant, like they were coming from underwater. His attention was fixed on the dog, on the slow rise and fall of its chest, on the way its ears twitched at every sound but its eyes never left him. There was intelligence there, yes, but more than that, there was patience, the kind that didn't rush you into being okay. "What's his name?" Daniel asked. His voice surprised him. It came out rough, unused, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. "Atlas," Mark replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He got a mind of his own. Atlas. The name settled into Daniel's chest, heavy and fitting. He looked at the dog again, noticing details he hadn't before. The faint scar along the bridge of its nose. A nick in one ear, barely visible unless you were looking closely. This wasn't a young dog. This was one that had been places, seen things, carried weight that wasn't always his own. Atlas leaned forward slightly, closing the distance even more, until his shoulder brushed Daniel's knee. The warmth was immediate, startling. Daniel sucked in a breath, fingers curling tighter into his coat as if bracing against a wave. He hadn't realized how cold he'd been until that second, I'll starve for contact. It's okay, Mark said quietly, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it to. He won't hurt you. Daniel almost laughed. Hurt. The word felt misplaced, like a warning that had come too late. I know, he said. I can tell. Atlas's tail thumped once against the concrete of soft solids. The dog's head tilted slightly, ears shifting, as if responding to something inside Daniel rather than anything he'd said aloud. Daniel's throat tightened. He lowered one hand slowly, giving himself time to pull it back if needed, and rested it gently on Atlas's shoulder. The fur was coarse beneath his fingers, damp with melted frost. Solid. Real. Daniel closed his eyes without meaning to, just for a second, and the world narrowed to that single point of contact. He felt his chest stutter, breath catching, emotion rising fast and uninvited. He pressed his lips together, jaw trembling. Mark noticed. He'd seen it before, though never quite like this. People broke in different ways. Some loudly, some quietly, some only when they thought no one was watching. He took a step back, giving them space, loosening the leash entirely. Atlas didn't move. A rough night? Mark asked, not prying, just opening a door and letting Daniel decide whether to walk through it. Daniel swallowed hard. The question cracked something loose. Yeah, he said after a moment. You could say that. Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with things unsaid, with shared understanding that didn't need explanation. Snow began to fall then. Light at first, flakes drifting down lazily, catching in Atlas's fur and melting almost instantly. Daniel watched them land on the dog's back, disappear, then land again. There was something soothing about the repetition, about watching something fall and not stay broke. Atlas shifted his weight, then did something unexpected. He lowered himself further, easing down until he was lying on the concrete beside Daniel's legs, his body pressed close. A quiet barrier against the cold. Daniel's breath hitched. He looked at Mark, unsure. He's fine, Mark said softly. If he didn't want to be here, he wouldn't. Daniel nodded, unable to look away from Atlas. He's different, he said. Oh, most dogs would have kept walking. Mark smiled, but there was something tired behind it. Most people do, too. The words landed harder than Daniel expected. He felt them echo in his chest, settling into the spaces he'd tried to ignore. He looked down at Atlas again, at the steady presence at his side, and felt something unfamiliar rise up through the numbness. Gratitude, sharp and aching. Daniel found himself talking then, not in a rush, not spilling everything at once, but slowly, carefully, like testing ice before stepping onto it. He didn't say everything. He didn't know how. But pieces came out. Enough. I used to have a family, he said quietly, eyes fixed. Falling, stun the 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 falling snow. The house that was always too loud, too messy. I complained about it all the time. He let out a soft, humorless breath. Funny how that works. Mark didn't interrupt. Atlas didn't move. The dog's breathing was steady, grounding. I lost my wife 2 years ago, Daniel continued. The words felt foreign in his mouth, heavy and sharp. Cancer. Fast. Too fast. His hand tightened in Atlas's fur without him realizing it. After that, everything else just kind of fell apart. The house, the job, friends. He shrugged weakly, but people don't know what to say. Eventually, they stopped calling. Snowflakes clung to his eyelashes. He blinked them away, throat burning. Night just got to me, he finished. I didn't want to be anywhere that reminded me of what I don't have anymore. Atlas shifted slightly, pressing his weight more firmly against Daniel's leg. The pressure was comforting, deliberate. Daniel let out a shaky breath, leaning into it without thinking. It felt strange, relying on a dog for support, but also natural in a way nothing else had felt in a long time. Mark cleared his throat quietly. "I'm sorry," he said, "for your loss." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. He stared out at the street, at the lights blurring through the snowfall, and felt the ache swell again. But it was different now. It wasn't as sharp. It had edges, yes, but it also had space around it, room to breathe. Atlas lifted his head then, turning to look up at Daniel. Their eyes met again, close enough now that Daniel could see the flecks of amber in the dog's dark gaze. There was no pity there, no judgment, just presence. "A good boy," Daniel whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice broke on the last syllable. Atlas's tail thumped once more. For the first time that night, Daniel realized something important. He wasn't being rescued in the dramatic way stories like to tell it. There were no sirens, no sudden miracles. This was quieter than that, slower, but it was real. Snow fell thicker now, softening the edges of the city, muffling sound, wrapping the world in a fragile kind of peace. Daniel sat on the bench with a police dog pressed against him, an officer standing guard nearby, and felt the smallest shift inside himself. Not hope, not yet, but the certainty that he wasn't as alone as he'd believed. And for tonight, that was enough. The night deepened quietly, the way it does when it realizes no one is rushing it anymore. Snow began to settle in earnest now, softening the sharp edges of the street, layering the city in a fragile stillness that felt almost reverent. The kind of silence that doesn't demand anything from you, that simply exists. Daniel hadn't noticed how tense his body had been until it started to loosen, muscle by muscle, as Atlas remained pressed against his leg, a living weight anchoring him to the present. Mark glanced at his watch, then back at Daniel. Protocol told him he should keep moving. Patrol routes were schedules, not suggestions. But experience told him something else entirely. Some moments mattered more than routine. Some pauses saved more than time ever could. "You okay sitting here a bit longer?" Mark asked, voice low. Daniel hesitated. The honest answer rose to his lips before he could stop it. "I don't really want to move," he said. It wasn't defiance. It was vulnerability, naked and unguarded. "Not yet." Mark nodded once. "That's all right." He shifted closer to the station wall, giving Atlas the full length of the leash without tension. "We can stay a few minutes." Atlas lifted his head at the sound of Mark's voice, ears flicking, then relaxed again when nothing changed. He stayed exactly where he was, flank warm against Daniel's knee. Daniel let his hand rest there, fingers splayed, feeling the steady rhythm beneath the fur. It reminded him of something he'd forgotten how to notice. That life, when it's close enough, has a heartbeat you can borrow strength from. Snow collected on Daniel's coat, melting slowly, dampening the fabric. He didn't mind. The cold felt distant now, like it had been pushed back to the edges of his awareness. What filled the space instead were thoughts he hadn't let himself have in a long time. He remembered another winter, years ago, standing in a living room cluttered with half-decorated boxes, his wife laughing as she untangled lights that never seemed to cooperate. He remembered complaining about the mess, about how late it was getting, about how tired he was. The memory stung, sharp and immediate, and for a moment his chest tightened again. Regret had a way of sneaking in when you least expected it. Atlas shifted slightly, sensing the change. He nudged Daniel's leg gently with his nose, a quiet reminder of now. Daniel exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the present, in the snow, in the warmth beside him. "Do you ever get tired?" Daniel asked suddenly, surprising himself. He didn't look at Mark when he spoke, didn't need to, of carrying things that aren't yours. Mark was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, there was no rehearsed answer, no professional distance. "Yeah," he said simply. "More than I'd like to admit." The admission mattered. It made the space between them feel shared, human. "How does he do it?" Daniel asked, nodding toward Atlas. "It just keeps going. Keeps showing up." Mark smiled faintly. "He's lost partners," he said. "Been injured more times than I can count. But every time he's cleared to return, he's ready. Tail wagging, focused, like none of it broke him." Daniel looked down at Atlas, at the scars he'd noticed earlier. "Maybe it did," he said quietly. "And maybe he just learned how to carry it." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Mark didn't respond because there was nothing to correct. A gust of wind swept through the street, lifting loose snow into brief spirals before letting it fall again. The Christmas lights across the road flickered, reflecting off the wet pavement in muted colors. Daniel watched them, thinking about how fragile joy could be, how easily it dimmed, and yet how stubbornly it tried to stay. "I didn't think I'd make it through tonight," Daniel said, the confession slipping out before he could pull it back. His voice was steady, but the meaning beneath it wasn't. "I didn't have a plan. I just kept walking." Mark's posture shifted subtly, alert but calm. He didn't rush in with questions or alarm. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "And I'm glad we found you." Atlas lifted his head again, eyes meeting Daniel's. There was no fear there, no urgency, just quiet agreement. Daniel swallowed hard. His hand trembled slightly as he rested it against Atlas's neck, fingers pressing into the thick fur. "Me too," he whispered. Snow had covered most of the ground now, a clean white layer that made the world feel newly written. Daniel wondered if that was how healing worked, not erasing what had been there before, but covering it gently enough that you could walk forward without cutting yourself on it every step. Time passed without announcing itself. Daniel didn't know how long they sat there, the three of them suspended in a moment that felt separate from the rest of the world. Eventually, Mark shifted again, more reluctantly this time. "We should head back soon," he said. "But I don't want to leave you like this." Daniel understood. The bench the night, the emotions still raw beneath the calm. "I'll be okay," he said, though the word felt tentative. "I think I just needed this." Atlas seemed to sense the shift too. He stood slowly, stretching, then turned to face Daniel fully. For a brief moment, he hesitated, as if weighing something unseen. Then he leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against Daniel's chest. The contact was brief, intentional, devastating. Daniel gasped, breath catching, tears finally spilling over despite his efforts to hold them back. He wrapped one arm around Atlas's neck instinctively, burying his face into the fur, not caring who saw. The sob that broke free was deep and shaking, pulled from a place he'd kept locked down for far too long. Atlas stayed still, grounding, unflinching. Mark looked away, giving Daniel the dignity of privacy in his breaking. When Daniel finally pulled back, wiping his face with the sleeve of his coat, his chest felt lighter, raw but open. Atlas stepped back, tail wagging softly, eyes bright. "Thank you," Daniel said, voice thick. He didn't know who he was thanking. Maybe both of them. Maybe the night itself. Mark smiled. "You did the hard part," he said. "He just reminded you how." They stood then, the moment drawing gently to a close. Mark clipped the leash back into his hand. Atlas stayed calm, obedient, but before turning away, he looked back at Daniel one last time. The snow continued to fall as Mark and Atlas walked down the street, their figures slowly fading into the soft white distance. Daniel remained on the bench for a while longer, watching the paw prints beside his own footprints, running parallel before disappearing into the night. For the first time in a long time, the emptiness inside him wasn't hollow. It was quiet, waiting. And somewhere beneath the cold and the grief, something steady and warm had begun to grow. Daniel stayed on the bench long after the sound of paws had faded, long after the officer's silhouette dissolved into the snowfall. The street felt different now, like a room after someone leaves behind their warmth. The cold crept back and slowly, testing its place, but it no longer owned him the way it had earlier. He noticed things he hadn't before. The way the snow softened the noise of passing cars, how the lights reflected like broken stars on the wet road, how his own breathing sounded steadier, deeper. Eventually, he stood. His legs protested, stiff and numb, but they held him. That alone felt like a small victory. He brushed snow from his coat and took one last look at the bench, at the shallow indent where Atlas had rested beside him. The space felt oddly sacred, like something important had happened there that didn't need witnesses to be real. He didn't know where he was going at first. He just walked. The city was quieter now, Christmas Eve slipping into Christmas morning. Windows glowed softly in nearby apartments, silhouettes moving behind curtains. A couple passed him holding hands, their laughter low and private. Daniel felt the familiar ache stir, but it didn't knock the breath from him this time. It passed through like a wave instead of a wall. He ended up at a small all-night cafe a few blocks away, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and old wood, the kind that never asked questions as long as you paid. The bell above the door chimed weakly as he stepped inside, warmth rushing to meet him. He stood there for a moment, blinking, overwhelmed by how simple and good it felt to be warm. The waitress looked up from behind the counter, eyes tired but kind. "A coffee?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said, then paused. "And whatever's hot," she nodded, already pouring. Daniel slid into a booth by the window, peeling off his coat and draping it beside him. He watched the snow through the glass, each flake illuminated briefly before disappearing. His hands wrapped around the mug when it arrived, the heat biting pleasantly into his palms. As he drank, his thoughts drifted back to Atlas, to the weight of him, the steadiness, the way he had stayed without being asked. Daniel wondered how many people Atlas had done that for, how many quiet rescues went unrecorded, unnoticed by anyone but the ones who needed them most. He finished his coffee slowly, savoring it, then another. By the time he left, the sky had begun to lighten just enough to hint at morning. Christmas Day. The word didn't hurt the way it usually did. Daniel found a shelter not far from the cafe, one he'd avoided for months out of stubborn pride and fear. This time he walked through the door without hesitation. The staff greeted him gently, efficiently. No judgment, no interrogation, just a bed, a blanket, a place to rest. He slept deeply for the first time in weeks. When he woke, it was late morning. Sunlight filtered weakly through the high windows, pale and cold but real. Daniel lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of others waking around him. He felt sore emotionally and physically, but beneath it was something unfamiliar. Stability. Over the next few days, that feeling followed him like a shadow, subtle, fragile, but present. He spoke to a counselor, ate regular meals, let himself exist without constantly bracing for collapse. And every so often, his mind returned to that bench, to the German shepherd who had chosen him in the dark. A week later, Daniel found himself walking the same streets again, this time in daylight. Snowbanks lined the sidewalks, dirty and melting. The station looked smaller, less intimidating. The bench was still there. He sat on it, hands resting on his knees, heart steady. He didn't know why he'd come back. Maybe to test himself. Maybe to honor something. He was lost in thought when he heard it again. The sound he would always recognize now. Paws on concrete. His head snapped up, heart leaping before logic could catch up. And there they were. Mark looked just as surprised to see him. "Hey," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I was hoping we might run into you again." Atlas stood beside him, alert, scanning the area. Then his gaze locked onto Daniel. The recognition was instant. Atlas's tail began to wag, controlled but unmistakable. He stepped forward without hesitation, closing the distance like it had only been minutes, not days. Daniel laughed, the sound bursting out of him before he could stop it, bright and real. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling despite the cold. Atlas pressed into him immediately, solid and warm, grounding him just as before. Daniel buried his hands in the fur, eyes stinging. "You look better," Mark said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I am," he said, and realized it was true. "I wanted to thank you, both of you." Atlas huffed softly, leaning harder into Daniel's chest. Mark watched them for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Atlas is retiring soon," he said. "His body's been through a lot. He's earned it." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. Retiring. Ending. Letting go. "What happens to him?" he asked, afraid of the answer. Mark smiled gently this time. "We find him a home. Someone steady, someone who understands him. Someone who understands him." Daniel's heart pounded, loud in his ears. The world seemed to narrow again, not with despair, but with possibility. He looked at Atlas, at the dog who had sat with him when he had nothing left, who had anchored him to life on its darkest edge. "I think," Daniel said slowly, voice shaking but sure, "I might know someone." Mark's smile widened, eyes shining. "I was hoping you'd say that." Snow fell lightly again, dusting the city in white. Daniel knelt there, arms wrapped around Atlas, feeling the future shift in quiet, irrevocable ways. Some rescues didn't end with sirens or applause. Some ended with a leash passed gently from one hand to another, with a promise unspoken but understood. And as Atlas rested his head against Daniel's chest, breathing slow and even, Daniel knew this wasn't just the end of a hard chapter. It was the beginning of something they would walk through together. The paperwork took longer than Daniel expected. Not because anyone was being difficult, but because life, when it finally begins to turn towards something good, seems to slow down just enough to make you feel every second of it. He sat at a small desk inside the precinct a few days later, pen hovering over forms, his name written and rewritten in careful letters that looked unfamiliar to him now, as if this version of himself hadn't existed long enough to feel real. Across the room, Atlas lay on the floor near Mark's chair, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Every so often his gaze lifted and found Daniel, just to check, just to make sure he was still there, Daniel noticed, every time. The building smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, a mix of long shifts and routine. Phones rang intermittently. Officers moved in and out with the quiet efficiency of people who knew how fragile the world could be. Daniel felt out of place and deeply grounded at the same time, like someone stepping into a life that had been waiting patiently for him to arrive. "You sure about this?" Mark asked gently, not doubting, just caring enough to ask. Daniel didn't hesitate. "I've never been more sure of anything." Mark nodded, his expression softening. "He chose you, you know. That night wasn't random." Daniel glanced at Atlas again. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and steady. "I think I needed to be chosen," Daniel said quietly. "By someone who didn't need anything from me except to show up." The final signature felt heavier than ink. When Daniel set the pen down, his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was accepting. Responsibility, companionship, a future that would require him to stay alive in ways he hadn't planned for before. Mark unclipped Atlas's leash and handed it to Daniel without ceremony. No speech, no dramatic pause. Just a simple transfer, like passing along something precious that deserved care, not spectacle. Atlas stood immediately, stepping toward Daniel as if the leash had always belonged in his hand. Daniel swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the handle, the leather warm from Mark's grip. The sensation grounded him in a way nothing else ever had. They stepped outside together. The air was sharp, clean, winter sunlight reflecting off the snow-covered street. Atlas walked beside Daniel with easy confidence, adjusting his pace instinctively, neither pulling ahead nor lagging behind. Daniel matched him without thinking. Their steps fell into rhythm, quiet and natural. The apartment wasn't much. One room, thin walls, a radiator that clanged like it had opinions. But it was clean, it was warm. And for the first time since his wife's laughter had faded from the corners of his life, it felt like a place that could hold something new without disrespecting what had been lost. Atlas explored slowly, methodically. He sniffed corners, checked windows, circled the space once before settling near Daniel's feet. Always near, always aware. Daniel watched him, a smile tugging at his lips, the kind that felt earned. He sat on the floor, back against the couch, and Atlas moved closer without invitation, pressing his side against Daniel's chest. The contact was firm, grounding, unmistakably intentional. "You're really here," Daniel whispered, resting his cheek against Atlas's head. "So am I." The days that followed were quiet, not empty. Morning walks before the city fully woke. Steam rising from manhole covers. Atlas alert but calm. Daniel's breath steady in the cold. People noticed them. Noticed the dog's posture, the man's softened expression. They didn't know the story, but they felt its weight. Daniel found work at a small hardware store nearby. Nothing glamorous. Honest. Routine. The kind of place where people remembered your name after a week. Atlas waited for him at home, patient and uncomplaining, greeting him each evening with restrained excitement that made Daniel laugh every time. At night, when the apartment settled into silence, Daniel sometimes woke from dreams that pulled him backward. Loss still visited him. Grief didn't vanish just because life improved. But now, when his breath shortened and his chest tightened, there was warmth beside him, a steady presence. Atlas would lift his head, press closer, breathing slow and deliberate, reminding Daniel without words that he wasn't alone in the dark anymore. Winter slowly gave way to something softer. Snow melted. Days lengthened. Daniel found himself standing taller, laughing more easily, speaking his wife's name out loud without feeling like the sound might break him. Atlas aged gently, joints stiff on colder mornings, muzzle graying further. Daniel adjusted, slowed down, learned patience the way Atlas had always known it. They returned to the bench one evening months later. Spring had arrived quietly, the city washed clean by rain. Daniel sat, Atlas at his side, leash slack. The station lights glowed behind them, no longer intimidating. Just another building in a world that had room for them both. Daniel rested his hand on Atlas's back, feeling the familiar rise and fall. He thought about that first night, the cold, the weight of despair, the way Atlas had stopped without being asked. Some rescues didn't look like rescues at all. They looked like companionship, like choosing to sit instead of walking away, like staying. Atlas shifted, pressing closer, eyes half-lidded in contentment. Daniel smiled, watching the city move around them, no longer separate from it. The world hadn't fixed itself, pain still existed, loss still lived. But so did something else now, something steady, something warm, something that breathed beside him and reminded him every day that survival could be quiet and still meaningful. As evening settled and the first stars blinked awake overhead, Daniel and Atlas rose together, footsteps aligned, heading home. Two lives once broken, now walking forward in the same direction, leaving a pair of parallel prints behind them. Proof that even the coldest nights can lead to a morning worth staying for.